You're listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. To guide us through the intricacies and intersections of emotions, relationships, and male identity is renowned psychologist, author, and speaker Gunter. This is Inspire Change.
I want to introduce a tradition here for this podcast and all future podcasts, wherein I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. They are the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. I pay my respects to the elders, past and present. Knowing the stories of the Aboriginal people will always be written in this landscape. Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspire Change. I hope you've been enjoying the last few podcasts. A slightly different tone, slightly different approach to content. And I want to continue this. I want it to be a bit more reflective, both on my end, but also for you as the listener. Reflect to get something out of it. Raise your awareness. Think about things. And so, the content of the last few episodes have been about important issues. But, when I think about it, especially in this age of rage, I think that we need to focus on some important elements. And one particular element I think that, is talked about a lot, but not necessarily in a way that's essentially often helpful for people, is the issue about what about love? What's love? Most of us talk quite freely about love and we throw it around. People, meet somebody and within 3 weeks they confess their love for them. But here's the question. Have you really sat back and reflected on what you are talking about when you think and talk about love? Can you really love somebody after knowing them only for 3 weeks? People often say to me, I've met my soulmate. And we've only known each other for a week, but it feels like we've known each other forever. Now, I have no doubt that in the moment, in that experience, that's a legitimate feeling in a sense, but is it truly love? Right? Or is it more about lust and attraction? And people who will talk about the soulmate will go, no, we connect on so many different levels. And, I appreciate that. It's probably true. But, my experience also is in the beginning of a relationship, we're all on our best behaviour as much as anything else. And we're often very cautious about, what we express. So, good question, right? So, the other observation is love simply an emotion, right? Is it just a feeling? The other question that comes up, especially for us as psychologists and psychiatrists, social scientists, is love purely biological or is it cultural? And how do I know which is which? Now, here's the thing. We constantly run up against this issue about nature versus nurture or biology versus psychology and the social, right? So let me construct a bit of a framework around that, okay? Now, if we're going to talk about love being biological, my view, and I'm going to put it right up front, is that we're fundamentally barking up the wrong tree. Now, let me elaborate on why I think that. And fundamentally, the argument here is that love is reducible to biological and chemical mechanisms that go on inside us. But it raises the question of which biological processes and what chemicals are love. Now, those people who purport to be reductionists will argue that since love is evident in all human cultures, it must be biological, right? Sort of stands to reason. It's a consistent issue. It's a consistent observation. But is it, in fact? is it when I speak about love the same as someone who's living in the Himalayas or in the Serengeti uh, grasslands in a tribe? Is that exactly the same? How do I know that? Now, one of the things that I also know is that the best that we can do in terms of a biological reductionist argument is to look at human bonding. And that's where a peptide hormone, a neuropeptide called oxytocin, that's typically produced in the hypothalamus and released by the pituitary gland, a sense of connectedness. It plays a role in social bonding, reproduction, childbirth, and the period after childbirth, right? But the definition doesn't mention love. It talks about bonding, right? And I know that, when women breastfeed or have close physical contact with their baby, they are bonding. But does that necessarily mean that they're going to feel a deeper sense of love? Right? Now, I'm not judging one way or another. I'm saying think about this. And I think all of us need to think about it. I think psychiatrists, psychologists, psychotherapists, we all need to get ourselves into a reflective place about what is it that we talk about when we talk about love. So if we're going to stick with that whole reductionist idea about biological and chemical mechanisms, then one way of understanding where I'm going with this is to look at the nature of water. Now, if I reduce water, that is H2O, to each of its molecules, then water consists of one oxygen and two hydrogen atoms. Now, here's the important question in this. Which makes it wet? Right? And with that one, I'm going to say sit with it. Okay, most of you are going to go, oh, yeah, this is a no-brainer. I understand. You've got to have both. And then it's about, I'll leave you with it. I'm not going to elaborate anymore. So fundamentally, if you look at what's out there in the literature and in studies, we know that psychologists, sociologists, and researchers actually disagree somewhat on the characterization of love. Okay? So again, many say that it's not an emotion in how we typically understand them, but an essential physiological drive. I.e., we come back to the reductionist nature. Okay? Evolutionary psychologists, evolutionary biologists would point at this. Okay, so if that's the case, how far back do we need to go for us to go, well, that's love, and that's not just bonding, or it's not just reproduction? Okay. The psychologist and biologist Enrique Bourna, I hopefully haven't butchered that too much, says that love is a physiological motivation such as hunger, thirst, sleep, and sex drive. I'll contemplate that in light of what I've already said. Now, conversely, the American Psychological Association defines it as a complex emotion. In other words, it's not just one emotion, but it's complicated, it's complex. Well, exactly what does that mean? Now, others distinguish between primary and secondary emotions and put love into the latter category, basically arguing that it derives from a mix of primary emotions. My argument is a little bit more extensive than that it's not just about emotion. My view is that when we're talking about love, we're actually talking about a complex of emotions, values, beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors that result in experiences of intimacy, of passion, and commitment. All right, so let me break that up a little bit. Okay, so love ultimately involves the idea of commitment. It's an attitude, it's not an emotion. Now, commitment leads to a behavior, and that is that whether the going's good or bad, I'm going to be sticking around with my partner. Right? That is my the expression of my behavior. It's also going to mean that I've got my partner's back. I'm committed to him or her or them. Care, right? So care is a feeling towards self and the other, but it also is expressed in behavior. So the point that I'm getting at with this is that we can feel, but unless it's expressed, how is the other person going to understand and know what's going on between us? Closeness is another aspect to the whole notion of love. That is, I feel connected, I feel close. Okay, and so that fundamentally is a feeling. I feel that. I can't necessarily put my finger on exactly why, but it's something that I feel. Now, for those of us who are very aware of this, can feel closeness irrespective of geography. We could be miles apart, and I can still carry in my being that sense of closeness. Now, another one that often comes up in the literature is the idea of protectiveness. Now, let me take out gender politics from this for a moment, okay? Because this gets really hairy. And in another podcast, I'm actually going to talk about this because it fascinates me. The whole thing about men being protective of women, right? There's problems with it. Let's just rest it there. But protectiveness is an attitude and a feeling and then a behavior, if necessary, in the right context. Okay, so let's move on. What else is there? Well, attraction. Now, attraction is a psychophysiological response to the other, the partner. They don't need necessarily be a partner. That can be a stranger. Attraction can be with a stranger. Does that mean I love them? So if this exists in isolation from all the others, is it still love? Right? I mean, all of us have had the experience that we see somebody who triggers in us a psychophysiological response. We get aroused, not necessarily strongly physically. It might be just an emotional, mental experience. Okay. Then there's affection. Right now, in my book, affection is the resulting behavior of love and all the things that go with love. Okay. And then finally, we talk about trust. And again, for me, trust is very much about an emotion. I can rest, I can feel, grounded, I can feel safe and secure, both in myself, but also with the other person. Now, I can already hear in the background some of you going, yes, but what about, the difference between friendship and romantic love and all that? And, I've been thinking a lot about this, and one of my issues with the idea of romantic love is that it's fundamentally a social construct that can be, in fact, quite misleading. I look at the literature from the Renaissance and how romance was expressed in that and there was the virginal female, the Madonna, the woman or girl that needs to be protected from the onslaughts of other men. So for me, we need to be very careful when we talk about romantic love. If it means that this is a person that I'm going to have a physical relationship with, well, we can have that, without it necessarily being romantic in the classic traditional style. It could be quite unromantic. Some people are just not romantic in the classical definition, but that doesn't mean they don't care, love, are committed to the person that they're with. So there's a few myths too that come with this whole thing. One of the things that people often say, love changes over time, right? So love could vary in intensity, and therefore, it's mutable, it's changeable. Well, what if love was consistent? Can I be angry with my partner and yet still love them? Of course I can. I can love my partner and be angry with them as well. What changes, and this is, I think, an important issue for a lot of couples in long term relationships, is that my attraction, my lust and arousal can change according to where the individual and the couple are in themselves and in their life. I mean, if you've got 3 kids under 4, you're going to really be pushed to feel sexy and erotic in your relationship with your partner. This possibly relates more to a lot of women than it does to men, because ultimately, in that context, a lot of women are the primary carer and nurturer of the children. So they're sort of saturated with meeting someone else's needs significantly more than necessarily a male is going to be. Although there's some role changes, but that's okay. But just in general, traditionally, okay? So we need to think about that. So love is a constant that needs nurturing, but lust and arousal changes, okay? So couples can go for a long time without being sexually aroused by each other, and then suddenly the lights are back on and we're on. It's also argued in the literature that love is associated with a range of positive emotions, including happiness, excitement, life satisfaction, euphoria. And often attached to that is that love also comes with some negative emotions. Now, here's the issue that I, put forward. Does it? Because the question arises is, if I'm having feelings like jealousy and stress or anxiety, does that say more about me than it necessarily does about the relationship or the other person? I've worked with people who are in relationships where one person feels intensely stressed by the relationship, whereas the other person is only stressed because their partner's stressed. And if their partner stopped stressing less, they would be okay. Right? So let me make a couple of points, and that is that love, in my opinion, does not result in negative emotions like jealousy and stress. Stress may be in a positive sense, but not in a negative stress where we're talking real, maybe distress. These emotions generally are the result of emotional insecurity and immaturity. And I'll make that very, very pointed remark around jealousy particularly. Jealousy is about fear of rejection and abandonment and my infantile rage or tantrum to dominate and control my partner so that I can feel okay. Shakespeare expressed this extraordinarily eloquently in Othello, where jealousy in fact became dangerous and destroyed people. Basically, Othello killed people. And then from memory, did he kill himself? I'll have to check that up. But anyway, jealousy is not an accompaniment to love. So if you're experiencing your relationship as stressful, I think you need to take a deep dive into why. You got to ask and reflect on the question, is it me? Is it the other person? Or is it the context that we're in? Right? And then as always, my observation is that, well, I need to take ownership for my part both in the problem and the solution. So if I have a strong and safely attached relationship with myself, I'm going to be more or less fragile, but more resilient in my pursuit of love and ultimately satisfaction. So, looking forward to getting some feedback, and I hope you enjoy exploring your experience of love and what love is really about. Until next time, this is me signing off.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. For more information on the Making Good Men Great movement, or for individual or group coaching sessions with Gunter, visit makinggoodmengreat.com. For inquiries regarding broadcast topics or appearing on the show, email Miranda@noirtainment.com. That's Miranda at NOIRTAINMENT.com.